So this is kind of riffing on the Earl Scruggs tune, Earl's Breakdown. This one's called Girl's Breakdown.
Hi, I'm Alison Brown, and I'm delighted to be doing the keynote address for today's conference about women in Bluegrass and American Roots music, a place in the band. I wish that we could be together today to enjoy in-person conversation and some Bluegrass fellowship, but since we can't be, I'm grateful that the Blue Ridge Music Center is giving us a virtual opportunity to gather, exchange ideas, and talk about the path forward for women in our music. I've spent a good part of my life and career both thinking about and living many of the questions that the panels will delve into later today. Namely, how do we draw more women into bluegrass music with the goal of achieving gender parity? How can we get better at supporting each other? What can we do to ensure that current and future generations of bluegrass girls enjoy every opportunity to realize their full potential? While women have certainly come more than a country mile from where we started at the birth of bluegrass music, those of us in the business know that there is still plenty of work to do. Amazingly to me, even in 2021, there are opportunities in bluegrass that aren't equally available to women, inequities that organizations like the IBMA Women's Council are working to reconcile. But in my opinion, we've never been in a better place than we are at this moment to shape the future that we want to see. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited to be able to share some of my thoughts today. My bluegrass journey began in the mid-1970s, cutting my musical teeth playing bluegrass in Southern California. For almost as long as I've been playing banjo, I've wondered why I didn't see more women in the music. It was the heyday of Gloria Steinem's feminist movement when my family moved to San Diego and I discovered bluegrass music at the local Shakey's Pizza Palace. Despite the fact that there weren't very many female musicians around, it never occurred to me that girls shouldn't play banjo, just that they didn't. From my earliest teenage years, I almost always played exclusively with guys. There were simply no girls to play with. And more often than not, they would offer me their best compliment, namely that I sure did pick good for a girl. Now those of you who've been doing this for a while knew that that's what I was going to say, and probably like most of you, I didn't consider it to be a backhanded compliment at the time. But with the perspective of years, I've come to recognize the institutionalized sexism that comment represents. It's true, there were barely a handful of female banjo players at the time, but rather than dwell on that, my approach was to try to lead by example, believing that if I was really good, the musical opportunities would follow, and perhaps, in the most important ways, that's turned out to be the case. But the glass ceiling, or you could say the grass ceiling, is real. It's that catch-22 of musicianship. How do you become a master of your instrument if you aren't invited to play with the music's masters? More and more women can get a place in the band, but can she get a place in the band? I remember the bright-eyed optimism of youth when anything seemed possible. But over time, my notion of the fairness of the market came to be replaced by the realization that certain doors just weren't going to open for me. A case in point was my now legendary and most definitely ill-conceived audition for Bill Monroe's band. Needless to say, Mr. Monroe and I had very different notions of exactly what it was I was auditioning for. I was still several years away from hearing the revelatory observation that John Hartford shared with me, namely that bluegrass music wouldn't exist at all if Bill Monroe hadn't been out chasing women. Well, that's not exactly how he put it. When I was in college, I managed to get approval from the History and Literature department to write my honors thesis on bluegrass music. I was looking at the music as a reflection of social change in post-war Appalachia, and a lot of my supporting material came from telephone interviews that I did with first-generation bluegrass musicians. Actually, most of them were done 37 years ago this month. On a February afternoon in 1984, I got up the nerve to call Bill Monroe. I was deeply curious to know what he would say about a woman's place in bluegrass music. Here's what he told me, and I quote, "Back in the early days, there wasn't many bluegrass girls, singers or players. They liked to travel, but they didn't think they'd fit in a group, I guess, or in a band. So a lot of them didn't try to learn bluegrass. I guess they thought the music was more so for the men, you know, the boys. And I think that's right. It's more so that way." When I interviewed Hazel Dickens a few weeks later about her experiences in the 50s, she told me, "You know, the men tried to get women not to fit into bluegrass. They put them in places where they couldn't fit. If you were a woman playing bass or something in a band, you were expected to sing country western. They wouldn't encourage you to sing bluegrass, but, you know, they would never own up to that. They just didn't want a woman in the group." What Bill and Hazel had to say didn't surprise me back then, and it's probably not a big surprise to most of you either. But what is surprising to me is how some of this history has been getting blurred with the passage of time. Someone said to me recently, "Alison, women have been in bluegrass music since the beginning, right? After all, Sally Ann Forrester played with Bill Monroe in the 1940s. So what's the big deal about women in bluegrass?" As it happens, I asked Monroe about Sally Ann Forrester. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sally Ann, she played accordion with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys in the mid-1940s and appears on his 1945 Columbia recordings, including Footprints in the Snow and Rocky Road Blues. Bill explained, "She was Howdy Forrester's wife. He was my fiddle player. You see, I needed a good fiddle man then, and Howdy Forrester, he could play real good. The times were hard and he would only work if I would hire Sally Ann too. So I did, and it worked out fine, because they were married." So this is the big deal as I see it. By design, Bill Monroe, the father and architect of bluegrass music, didn't see a place in the band for women in bluegrass music. So the lack of women in bluegrass when I was growing up in the 70s was the natural result of what you could say was Monroe's musical and social aesthetic for his music. There was one exception though. A woman did have a place in the band if she could participate within the context of a family unit, with her spouse like Sally Ann Forrester or Wilma Lee Cooper, or in a family band like the Stoneman family, Maddox Brothers and Rose, or the Lewis family. The idea of a woman on the road as a band leader or side person was not a fit with the social conventions of mid-century America. That reality was still many years in the future. But fortunately, there were a handful of female bluegrass pioneers that bucked convention and persevered against tremendous odds to carve a path through the bluegrass landscape of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them leading bands, and most of them suffering setbacks in the form of discrimination, lack of opportunity, and marginalization in the process. Women like Ginger Boatwright, Gloria Bell, and the Buffalo Gals, to name a few. And we are the beneficiaries of their struggles. They paved the way for the proliferation of female band leaders in the mid-1980s, women who led not just their bands, but the music itself, pushing the musical envelope and reimagining a sound that has come to define bluegrass music in the 21st century. I was fortunate to be a member of Alison Krauss and Union Station in the late 80s and early 90s, a time which I see as a real watershed moment for women in bluegrass. For this California girl, traveling the Appalachian states playing banjo in a nationally touring band was a fundamental part of my transformation from part-time picker into banjo player. It helped me to understand better the Southern culture that gave rise to bluegrass music, and it gave me the platform from which to make my own contribution to the furtherance of women as banjo players, both in remote regions of the U.S. where people figured that Alison and I must have been sisters because we had the same name. Yes, that really happened. And in Pakistan, where I shocked an audience by changing my own broken banjo string mid-song. Apparently, banjo string repair is considered a man's job in Pakistan. Well, during that time, there was a proliferation of female-driven bands. Lori Lewis, Rhonda Vincent, Lynn Morris, Claire Lynch, and Alison Krauss were all making genre-defining records, shaping the direction of the music, attracting a new audience, and normalizing the idea of women in the music. Together with Missy Rain, Sally Van Meter, Andrea Zahn, and others, we were in effect role models for a new generation of women in bluegrass, a generation that includes two of my fellow bandmates and the First Ladies of Bluegrass, Molly Tuttle and Sierra Hall. Sierra Hall is usually too polite to mention it, but she was born the same year that I won the IBMA's Banjo Player of the Year award. But she's never reticent to talk about the impact that seeing other female bluegrass musicians had on her. I've heard her mention that when she was starting out, she saw Rhonda Vincent on stage playing mandolin and leading a band, and that empowered her to imagine herself up on stage doing the same thing. There's tremendous value in role models, and for girls coming into the music these days, there's no shortage of women to emulate. With all-female supergroups like Della Mae, Sister Sadie, and the First Ladies of Bluegrass, the uninitiated might be forgiven for thinking there was ever a time when, as Bill Monroe said, women thought the music was more so for the men. And while there's much work yet to do, we've made tremendous strides. Last year, bluegrass music celebrated the 75th anniversary of that pivotal moment in December 1945 when Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt joined Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, scorched the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, and gave birth to the bluegrass sound. For me, the historical mile marker is both sobering and inspiring. Sobering that it's taken so many years for women to gain traction in bluegrass. In fact, the impetus behind the First Ladies of Bluegrass was to celebrate the fact that there were finally 5 women who had won the IBMA's Instrumentalist of the Year award, something that took over a quarter of a century, 27 years to be exact, to achieve. Yet it's completely inspiring to me that despite many odds, we've finally reached a tipping point in the music. While the history of bluegrass was written by its founding fathers, I believe that women will write the next chapters of the bluegrass story. Couple the appeal of a female voice with the instrumental finesse so many female players are bringing to the music these days, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better ambassador than a woman to bring bluegrass music to the mainstream audience. In various types of American institutions, it's acknowledged that once women reach a critical mass of 20 to 30%, they fundamentally change the way that institution functions. Over the past decade, I think we've seen that happen in bluegrass. Many women, some of them are featured panelists today, have achieved leadership roles throughout the bluegrass ecosystem, from artists to artist managers, from writers to publishers, promoters, journalists, DJs, label executives, and more. That ubiquitous 20th century compliment, "you sure do pick good for a girl," has all but faded into history, because really, who wouldn't want to pick like a girl? Do you mean Kristen or Becky? Bebe or Gina? Deanie or Kimber? The list goes on and on. So now that women have achieved critical mass in bluegrass music, what will we do with our platform? How do we get to a place of greater parity in the music? And what future can we imagine for ourselves and the women who will come after us? How will we achieve it? The tools have never been more at hand, and now it's up to us. Let me offer a few thoughts for our path forward. First of all, we must support and create opportunities for each other. We're no longer in the position of having to rely on men as the sole gatekeepers for opportunities. We can create them for each other. In fact, in my first 2 nationally touring gigs as a banjo player, it was a female band leader who created the opportunity for me. Not a coincidence, and a fact that's not lost on me. By return, whenever I'm in the producer's chair on a project, I'm always trying to include female players on every session. And with an expanding list of female engineers, it's getting easier and easier to make sure that there's gender parity in the control room as well as in the tracking room. The ways we can support each other are really just limited by our imaginations. For example, if you promote or program festivals, help the effort by making sure that women are represented in the lineup and not just programmed as novelty acts. I've heard so many all-female bands tell me that they are never at a festival the same day as another all-female band. That is not okay. I can tell you as a member of an occasional all-female band that all-female bands are not all the same. We don't play the same songs and we don't sound the same. So not programming us on the same day makes no more sense than saying Ricky Skaggs and Kentucky Thunder can't play the same day as the Del McCoury Band. So please, let's try to get past that now. If you're a DJ, can you shoot for parity in programming? There's been a lot of talk about this in country music. A 2019 article in Rolling Stone reported that, based on the sheer number of spins and not just chart appearance, the ratio of men to women played on country radio was 10 to 1. You might think that radio is not as biased in bluegrass and roots music, but a quick glance at last week's charts showed women to be 3 out of the top 20 on the Bluegrass Today weekly chart and 2 out of the top 20 on the Americana weekly chart. Maybe some of this is a function of the number of female to male releases right now, but that's still a pretty dismal ratio. Since bluegrass and roots radio shows are less chart-oriented and new release-driven than more commercial-leaning formats, and draw more heavily on catalog albums, maybe we can use that leniency to be sure that bluegrass and roots radio is more inclusive and gender diverse. The idea of support can reach beyond the professional sense too. Even if you're not a professional musician and don't work in the business side of the industry, you can still play an important part in the effort. If you have the financial resources, consider contributing to the IBMA Foundation's Sally Ann Forrester Scholarship to support educational opportunities for women in bluegrass. No matter where you are in the ecosystem, remember that even something as small as a well-timed word of encouragement or an invitation to join the circle to jam can mean the world. Organizing our efforts to support and create opportunities for each other through mentorship and educational programs needs to be a priority as well, so I'm glad that we'll have a panel discussion about that later today. During my brief stint in corporate America as an investment banker, I noticed how much more deftly men seemed to bring along their next generation than women did. Rather than letting the perception of limited opportunities divide us, I think it's crucial for us to work together to share what we know through networking, educational programs, and mentorship programs with our up-and-comers. There are finally enough of us in positions of leadership throughout the bluegrass ecosystem, and I believe the time's right for these types of initiatives to thrive. And I'm really glad that we have organizations in the industry, including Change the Conversation, Sound Girls, She Said So, and the IBMA Women's Council that are working towards supporting this goal. Finally, even as our minds are engaged in imagining our future, we must not forget our past. We have to make sure that our history is told accurately and that the challenges the first female pioneers in bluegrass faced and overcame aren't forgotten, minimalized, or footnoted. Young women coming into bluegrass now must know the stories of the women who blazed the trail for them and helped to create the legacies that they are inheriting. As a starting point, I'd suggest digging into a copy of Murphy Henry's excellent and comprehensively researched book, Pretty Good for a Girl. And with excellent institutions like the Blue Ridge Music Center and the Bluegrass Music Hall of Fame and Museum, we have great platforms for telling the story that didn't exist in the recent past. To quote that Virginia Slims ad of the 1970s, "We sure have come a long way, baby." It's only by remembering the long road that we've traveled that we can appreciate the fullness of this moment, both with its rich opportunities and attendant responsibilities. A woman's place in the band has been hard-won, but women in bluegrass are here to stay. Imagining bluegrass music these days without women would be like, well, imagining a life of quarantines and wearing masks and social distancing. You can imagine it and even live it, but all of us can acknowledge how much of the depth and richness has been missing. For music that was born out of hard times in post-war Appalachia, bluegrass music has, in the hands of subsequent generations, shown an amazing ability to bend, to transcend demographic barriers, and speak to the times. All you need to do is spend a few hours at IBMA's annual World of Bluegrass Conference to see that what was once the bastion of Southern white men has become a music that's played by women and men from countries all over the world. Many of the old barriers to entry have fallen away, and these days, it takes more than the fingers on one hand to list the number of women who've smashed the grass ceiling. And so, with women, both on the stage and behind the scenes, leading with their talent and vision, helping each other to achieve their fullest potential, I'm extremely optimistic about the future. I know that women will play a pivotal role in writing the next chapters of the bluegrass story, and I can't wait to live the history that we will create together.